next 10 years, if it were to try to catch up, this is all the municipalities, states, etc., it would be 1.6 trillion with a T. So it's a lot of money. But I think that, from my perspective, one of the things I was interested in when I came down here was that I think Chula Vista is in a position right now that if we do the right kind of planning and thinking about where this funding can come from, we still have the opportunity to get a handle on this. And I know you know from having been in other parts of this country that they're way past that. They're into the stage where lots of stuff is failing. See these examples in the national news of big bridge collapses, that sort of thing. I don't think we're in that position, but if we don't start, doing the things now, we could find ourselves in a position where we've got a lot of things that are failing. So where does the money come from? If you think about it, initially, in most cases, the infrastructure that we have came from the development. We've seen a lot of that recently in the last 10 to 15 years out in the eastern part of the community. The developer comes in, whether they're building houses or businesses, we expect them to, and they do, put in the infrastructure. They put in the sewer lines, the water lines, the streets, the traffic lights, etc. So that initial investment comes from the development community, but it's paid for by whoever buys those houses or buys those businesses. So they're paying for it initially. So in most cases, we'll talk tonight about missing infrastructure where that didn't happen, largely in southwest Chula Vista. But most times nowadays, we get the initial infrastructure paid for by whoever's going to buy the house or buy the business or that facility. So we're really not talking about, in most cases, putting in new stuff, except for missing infrastructure. We're really talking more about where does the money come from to maintain that on a large scale thereafter. And in general, the money comes from some level of government, the federal government, the state government, or in our case, the local government. But ultimately, it comes from where all the money comes from, and that is a citizen or the residents. Because they pay federal taxes or state taxes, or they pay for it themselves through some kind of assessment district. From a federal perspective, generally what we're talking about here at the local level, because they do a lot of things like highways and that sort of thing. But as far as federal funding for local kinds of things, what we're really talking about is grants. In some cases you can get earmarks. And in some cases they have low or no interest loan programs. And generally speaking, the public's not involved in that. I mean, they pay their taxes and that's where the money comes from, but they don't have a vote in that. But as you get to the state and local level, in a lot of cases, in most cases really, the public is involved in deciding whether they want to spend money, frankly, on those kinds of projects. And an example at the state level would be these infrastructure bonds that the governor got passed, I think it was a year or two ago. And so what happened? They do a ballot initiative and the voters either voted up or they voted down. And I think that, in my experience, you're more apt to get them to participate in something like that if they have a really good idea of what they're going to get for their money. And so I think that that's important as we look to the future about how are we going to fund these projects. So from a state funding perspective, it's very important for us to make sure that we're involved in those programs. So for example, the infrastructure bonds that the governor got passed, there's lots of buckets of money. And we're very much involved with our staff, and particularly in engineering and federal services, in making sure that as the rules are established on how to get that money, that we're right there, we're getting our applications in on time and that sort of thing. So at the local level, I think we have a couple of fairly recent examples of how this also works. One of those was the Transnet extension. The Transnet was around for a long time and it provided funding for the regional transportation system, which includes roads and things within our own communities, those more multi-lane kinds of streets. So a couple of years ago, it was getting ready to expire. And so there was a need to go back out to the public and ask them again to support an extension of that to provide the kinds of infrastructure transportation funding that was needed in this region. And I thought you might be interested to know that we took a look at how did the voting turn out for that. As it turns out, the county, Sandag wide, let's say, the vote came in at 67%. But we looked at how did Chula Vista vote? And it turns out that the people, the residents of Chula Vista that voted on that, voted at 73%. And so I'm not sure what the message is in that, but I think it could be that, again, if people know what they're going to get for their money and it's important to them, then they may be willing to do that. The most recent example we actually have of it's a different kind of voter participation, was actually the sewer rates last Tuesday night. That's a different kind of vote because in the case of the Transnet, that's an affirmative vote. You take all the votes and you add them up, and if, in that case, if you don't have 2/3, it doesn't pass. In the case of the sewer rates, that's actually what we would call a protest vote. So we send out, the 52,000 notices, but you'd actually have to get more than half of those people to send it back in. So that's a little harder to expect people to do. But in that case, we only had, I think it was 47 people that protested that out of 52,000. So I'm not sure what we can make of that, but that's another example of where the people at least had some opportunity to participate in their destiny, if you will, as far as infrastructure goes. And I would tell you that as we look at, through this infrastructure management program, when we look at all the different types of infrastructure we have, from a capital perspective, where we need to spend capital money, the system in this city that's in the best shape is the sewer system. And I think that part of the reason for that is that there's actually local control. It's a protest vote type of mechanism, if you will, to go out to the public and say, do you want us to maintain that? And so a part of what that fee increase was about was, as Jack and others explained the other night, was actually that capital component. It's the component that allows us to go in and either line or replace bad sewer lines, that sort of thing. And so I wanted to give you some examples of that sort of thing, because at the next workshop we're going to be talking about a whole host of things that Jack or one of the staff will mention at the end of this presentation as the various different opportunities like assessment districts, etc.
One of the comments